Good afternoon. It's improving, only twice today. That's great. And welcome, everyone. Before I introduce today's speaker, I know you would like to welcome back to Scranton the founding father of the Schemmel Forum, Harmer Brennan. Harmer has just returned from his own Odyssey to ancient Greece. He traveled by air and not by sea. We are truly honored to have today's speaker with us here at the Schemmel Forum. The first female translator of the Odyssey, according to The Guardian, will change our understanding of this classical masterpiece forever. They said in their review that it is crisp and musical after translations that express centuries of masculinist, and I have never heard that word before, readings of the poem. I would like to share with Dr. Wilson that the classics are no stranger at the University of Scranton. We have a strong classics faculty and a number of interested undergraduates, as well as continuing ed students like ourselves. Dr. Wilson was educated at Balliol College, Oxford, and is a professor in the Department of Classical Studies and chair of the program in Comparative Literature and Literary Theory at the University of Pennsylvania. We are particularly proud to present a scholar who brings to this ancient poem her innovative imagination and skills. Please welcome her to the podium.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction, and thank you everybody for being here. Please feel free to continue having your lunch. So I'm delighted to be here, and I'm going to talk about my approach to translating the Odyssey, and why did I think that the world might need yet another English translation of this much translated poem, of which there were already almost 70 translations in English alone, not even setting aside all the other languages, when I decided to waste 5 years of my life doing it. So why did I do that? I think it's a weird thing to do. It's not an obvious project. But before I get to talking about my approach and why I felt I did have something different to bring to the English Odyssey, I thought I should start at the end of the conversation, picking up on the lovely introduction on this whole question of am I the first woman to translate the Odyssey? No, in fact, I'm not. There were plenty of translations by women in other languages. There was one in French by a woman 400 years ago. There were lots in French, Italian. There's one in Turkish by a woman. There's one in Dutch by a woman, and so on. So it's a very Anglo-centric idea to present me as the first woman ever to do this. And I think there are certain things that are both good and bad about the reception of this translation, primarily in terms of gender. So I'm just going to show you the reception, and for a long time it seemed as if every review had the word woman in the title. So there was this interview, woman, 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 woman. Could the Odyssey have been the work of a woman? No, I don't think it could, but because this is a review of my book, and because I happen to be a woman, therefore that's the title that's given to it. I was very grateful in the end for the few headlines which didn't have the word woman in the headline. So I think there's good and bad about this. My translation obviously wouldn't have got the attention it did get if I wasn't a woman. I'm happy to think that my translation might be doing something to inspire and open doors for younger women, maybe also people of colour and people of different social identities in the worlds of classics or poetry or translation or history or the humanities more broadly, and also to open people's eyes to the fact that, in fact, social identities do matter for the words we speak, for the ways we interpret. They matter if you're a journalist or a historian or a writer or a poet. It matters who you are that's bringing in interpretation. But I also think that there are certain issues with presenting my translation as the woman's Odyssey, and then there are all these others that are just normal translations, which is what happens to a lot of women's work, that it gets put in a particular box which has girls on it, and that's actually a way of ghettoizing, even if it seems like it's a way of celebrating. So I just want to make 3 points. So this is part of the issue. I want to make 3 points that I think aren't fully recognized in some of the fluffier kinds of press coverage. One is that my being the first woman to translate the Odyssey into English isn't really a headline that should be about me. The headline should be, why is it that this particular field, the field of classical translations of Greek and Roman texts, has been so vastly male-dominated, and by a particular kind of male classicist, the very old white male classicist. That isn't the only kind of classicist. Slightly over half Ph.D.s in the US are awarded in classics, are awarded to women. There are plenty of women who have very high skills in ancient Greek and Latin, and yet this particular field, in terms of the translation of those texts for the general public, has not involved a lot of people who aren't in that very tiny demographic category. It's hard to figure out exactly what are the structural reasons why that is the case. I think part of it is to do with devaluing of translation in general in the academy, lack of understanding about the fact that translation is an interpretive and a scholarly, and as well as creative, writerly activity. If you think it's just about 2 + 2 is 4, you just scoop out the meaning and plonk it down in a different language, then you might think it doesn't matter who does that, so we don't need to worry about the fact they're all men, because maybe the woman would say exactly the same thing. I don't think translation is like that whatsoever, but I think that simplistic way of thinking about translation, I think, is actually still very common, even among people who know other languages and ought to know better. So second point is that being female doesn't in itself guarantee that you'll have a distinctively female or feminine perspective in any noticeable way. Women can be misogynistic perfectly easily. Many women aren't feminists. Many women haven't thought about gender whatsoever. I think that doesn't detract from the fact that I would like there to be more translations of Greek and Roman classics by women. I would love there to be just as many thoughtless and badly written translations by women as there already are by men. But I also do think that it's not guaranteed that you're going to have a critical attitude about gender because you're a woman. You can test this out. For instance, if you look at some of those other translations I talked about, the translations into French, Italian, and so on, by women, they're all different from each other. It's not obvious if you sort of did a test of, can I guess which ones are by a woman? I don't think you could whatsoever. If you look at the first woman to translate Homer into English was Caroline Alexander, whose Iliad translation came out a few years before my Odyssey. It's completely different in its style and in its approach to the whole project. So the whole idea that you can put the women's version of this project in one box and then everybody else is in a different box, it doesn't actually stand up to any kind of study of the field. So my particular interest in gender in this text is informed by having read some feminist scholarship rather than by I'm wearing a dress today. And then final point is just that men have gender identities as well. And I think it's a problem that we never seem to notice that or ask them about them. This maybe relates to the melanism issue. I've been asked a gazillion trillion times by interviewers, so what do you think about the female characters? You must really like the female characters. And quite often the whole interview is about that. And I've read some interviews by my predecessors, Robert Fagles, Stanley Lombardo, Robert Fitzgerald. They were never asked, you must really like the male characters. How does your male perspective bring unique insights into this text? And yet, in fact, if you look at their translations, you can see how there are unique male insights, or one could call it that. So I think we should start asking men those questions and stop asking me about it. So now I'm going to turn to, that was all preamble, and now I'm going to turn to talk about why, when my lovely editor at Norton, with whom I'd worked on the anthologies of, not an anthology of world literature, not an anthology of Western literature, why, when he approached me to ask if I'd consider doing a new translation of the Odyssey, why did I say yes, even though there are so many translations of the Odyssey already out there? This is a very selective list. This is a list of some of the more well-known verse translations, which includes a lot of free verse translations, and then there are lots of prose translations as well. And in fact, as you'll kind of see even just looking at this list, the pace hasn't slowed down. In fact, the pace has picked up. There are more and more and more. There have been 2, at least, that I know about since my translation came out. There are gazillions of them out there. So why add yet another one to this huge pile? I was excited by the idea of spending more time rereading this poem that I've been reading in Greek for 3 decades now. I find myself obsessed with it all the time. It's about questions that I think about in my daily life as well as my scholarly life, about time, identity, whether we can be the same person after 20 years or in a new place or with new people, about how to deal with those who aren't like us, which maybe is everyone, about home, hiding, rage, grief, recognition, imagination. It's a poem which turns the details of everyday life, like boats, weapons, trees, beds, into these richly resonant material symbols of divine and human relationships. It's both magical and very practical. And I love the language as well, the Greek language, the Homeric Greek language. But loving the poem and wanting to keep on rereading it in the original is a totally different thing from thinking it's worthwhile to take on the writerly and poetic task of producing a new verse translation. So I had a close look at a little bit in multiple translations beside the Greek and realized I felt I did have something that I wanted to bring out about the original that was different from what was already there in the translations that my students were able to read in English. I guess just most generally, I felt that this was an opportunity to offer a different kind of hospitality to Homer, this immigrant from a very, very alien, distant culture. The Odyssey itself is all about hospitality. It's all about zhenya, the idea that you're supposed to welcome strangers into your home, offer them hospitality. As an immigrant myself, I had this awareness that people tend to stereotype immigrants from different places. They tend to think, if you're Korean, you have to be hardworking. If you're Latina, you have to love dancing. If you're British like me, you're supposed to think royal family is so interesting. Have they had another baby? Let me tell you all about it. I don't really care about that very much. So I felt that there were ways that Homer has also got put into a particular box, a particular set of stereotypes about what kind of voice does this ancient poet have. He has to sound archaic, he has to have a silly foreign accent that's about being bombastically epic, because we have our own preconceptions about what epic poetry sounds like. I didn't think those were very good preconceptions, and I wanted to have a different style and also a different approach to what kind of poem is this. In terms of form, the Odyssey is, as you all know probably, composed in dactylic hexameter. So a dactyl is a finger, long, short, short. Everyone has a finger like that if you have fingers, if you're lucky enough to have them. La, la, la. And it's hexameter, so it's 6. So it does that 6 times over every single line. Andra moi ennepe musa polutropon hosmala polla. It's 6, and it's like that all the way through. It's regular metrically. And yet, most modern translations are in free verse or in prose. They don't have a regular rhythm. I put up here the first English translation, the first 2 lines of the first English translation by the great dramatist George Chapman, and then the famous one by Alexander Pope, both of which, as you can see, are in pentameter rhyming couplets. And they also both translate polutropon as if it had something to do with wisdom, which it certainly does not. So one possibility would be to try to mirror the hexameters of Homer in something like hexameters in English. This actually hasn't been done very often, but quite common is to use a long line which, if you sort of close your eyes and don't read it out loud, looks like it would be hexameters. I decided not to do that, not to try to use either real or fake hexameters, because I don't think it quite works to do an alien rhythm in English. There isn't a native tradition of we have long poems and drama in hexameters. Paradise Lost is not in hexameters, it's in pentameter. Shakespeare doesn't write in hexameters, he writes in pentameter. So I wanted to use the native meter of iambic pentameter. These are just examples of some of the top-selling free verse translations. And you can also see just from this illustration that they're actually quite similar to each other in certain verbal ways, which clearly comes from the fact that they've read each other. You can see how we have wanderer, and then we have wanderer. We have plundered, then we have plundered. We have time and again, then we have time and again. So I hadn't noticed this when I first started doing my translation, but I deliberately, while doing mine, didn't look at other translations while I was working on my translation. And in retrospect, looking at things like this, I feel grateful that I didn't do that, because I think it's better if there is a real choice about what translation, rather than if you think there were multiple different things I could choose, and in fact, they're not really different because they're all borrowed from each other. So I wanted to use meter, partly because I felt like the regularity of the rhythm and the music is an essential element of the fact that Homer is based on oral tradition. It grew out of the centuries-long period in which there was no literacy in the Greek-speaking world. So it's a poem which is designed for oral performance. If you compose in a non-metrical verse form, I think you don't invite reading out loud in quite the same way that you do if you have a regular beat. I also chose to use the same number of lines as the original to keep the pace. If you don't do that, there's a tendency to expand, because you're always going to be tempted to think, this word could mean 5 different things or 100 different things, let me just plonk down 3 and cover my bases, and then you end up with a translation that's a lot longer than the original, which has a cost in terms of how fast does the story move along. So mine is the same number of lines as the original. So I wanted, in general, to convey something of the musicality, clarity, vividness, emotional and psychological depth, range, multivocality, beauty, and narrative drive that are essential elements of my own reading of Homer. I guess one big question that comes up for every translator of Homer is what to do about all the repetitions. The original is a very repetitious poem, which comes about also from the fact that it's based on an oral tradition. Within an oral culture, repetition has a particular set of values. It's how do we remember things if we can't write them down? We have to repeat. And therefore, the things that are repeated are important, and they carry with them our shared memories. They're a way of defining the community and defining our culture. In a primarily literate culture like ours, repetition means something totally different. Either it means a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose is a rose, I'm Gertrude Stein, I'm doing a modernist experiment, or else, more likely, it means this is a cliche, I'm repeating it because I haven't thought about what I'm saying. And neither one of those things is actually what the Homeric repetitions are doing. So I felt I couldn't, to convey the same vividness as I found in the original, repeat quite as much as the original does. I repeat some. I have a lot of wine dark seas. I have a lot of horse lord Nestor. So because I want to have give the reader some flavour of those repetitions going on. But I also wanted sometimes to mix up the way the components are put together. So that's the point of giving you this line. The line about rosy-fingered dawn is repeated in the same way in the original multiple times. Whenever it comes up in my translation, I shift things around. So there's the same components. There's always goddess dawn, she's born, or she's early born, or she's newborn. She always has roses or flowers. She always has touching or fingers. But I mix up those components, which is really fun to do. The question of verse form is related to larger issues about style. I know that some readers have wanted to label my translation as colloquial or simple or readable. I think it is. I hope it's readable. But I don't think it's entirely on the level of chatting like in a normal conversation, even beyond the fact that we don't normally talk in iambic pentameter all the time. I also wanted to make sure that I had some moments when the language wasn't totally neutral, that it always felt a little bit off from real speech, even if it wasn't difficult to understand. So, for instance, I don't use any contractions like doesn't, don't, didn't, in order to just create a kind of speech which is not quite the same as the way people really speak. I also use some strange words where I hope people will think, this is kind of weird, and I want people to think this is kind of weird. I've had readers say, I found that word choice a little bit jarring, and I think, yes, I'm glad I jarred you. Because in fact, the original is composed in a range of different dialects from all over the Greek world, from multiple different periods in time. Because this was a tradition which went on for centuries, during which time there was no writing. So I felt I couldn't fully replicate that without violating all contract between the writer and the reader. If you want it to be readable and emotionally engaging, then you can't write in a way that includes a lot of Chaucerian English and a lot of Cockney slang and a lot of Glaswegian, and mix it all up and you get some wonderful equivalent to what Homer's like. But there's no tradition in English which is like that, and it would just feel like a great Joycean experiment rather than. I would have had fun with it, but my readers wouldn't have. So I just put in a few words where I felt like you might be surprised, right? But I couldn't make people surprised about every word. Translation theorists like Anton Berman and Lawrence Venuti, echoing the theologian Schleiermacher, have argued that translations have an ethical obligation to write in a style they call foreignizing, or what you might less charitably call translationese. There's a dominant argument that foreignizing is the only way to pay due respect to alien cultures, rather than forcing them into the hegemonic Anglophone mode. I completely agree with a lot of this analysis. I think there is a huge problem in North American and British cultures about questions of translation and non-Anglophone literatures. But I don't think there's a sort of blanket solution to translate all foreign texts in a totally off-putting foreignizing style, which seems like the quick way to make sure the people read even less translated literature than they already do. I think there are also different issues if you think about, as Venuti and Berman are primarily thinking about the contemporary novel. I think that's actually somewhat different as a field from the field of translations of ancient literatures. Within classics in particular, badly written translations are often tolerated and even highly valued because they replicate the experience of the struggling student in intermediate Greek class. The pain is supposed to be authenticating. But I actually don't think that that's the experience we should be replicating. I think we should be replicating the experience of somebody who is fluent in reading Homer and enjoys it. And we know that in antiquity, people loved Homer, and they actually thought of it as pleasurable entertainment, rather than you have to slog through this because this is the only way to get to being cultured. We're accustomed to taking for granted a totally debatable binary, the idea that translations are either faithful or they're poetic, they're loose or they're literal. That binary relies on the false idea that there's only one thing the original ever means. But of course, in fact, the quote-unquote literal translation is very often totally unfaithful to the form, the style, the emotional effect of the original. So what kind of thing is equivalent? There are multiple different equivalences that one could be thinking about. The real question for a translator isn't, do you want to tell the truth or are you going to lie? It's a much more complex set of issues, which truths to tell. There are many true facts about any original text, not all of which can ever be conveyed in another language. For me, one of the most important truths I wanted to tell about the Odyssey was that it's a complex, polyvocal poem. I've seen from teaching it that there's an idea that this is the Odyssey. It's about an unproblematically heroic male Western hero, implicitly white, who is good because he crushes the bad guys, monsters, foreigners, and witchy women, and understands the value of hospitality. Zhenya, you write it down and get an A on the exam. And the story has a happy ending because the good guy gets back with the objectified wife and regains all his wealth and all his slaves. So it's a nice celebration of family values, consumerism, patriarchy, war, superiority of normal male white people over foreigners and girls. I don't think I would like the Odyssey if I thought that was all it was. In fact, I know I wouldn't. I really dislike that poem very intensely. I think the Odyssey itself is a much better poem than that. And I felt that in looking at other translations a little bit, that there's this tendency to make it more like that because it makes it simpler. It's much easier if you think this is a poem which only looks from the perspective of Odysseus, which in fact I don't think it does. I think it explores two central Greek concepts, both of which it interrogates, questions, pushes back against, as well as looking at. The first concept, of course, is nostos, the word from which we get nostalgia, which is a story of homecoming. You might think homecoming or being at home would be very straightforward, just means getting back where you live. But the Odyssey is exploring a case where home and homecoming are as difficult as they could be. Odysseus gets home geographically halfway through the poem. That clearly is not enough for the nostos to be complete. At what stage is it complete? The final moment when we see Odysseus, he's slaughtering his fellow Ithacans in revenge in a battle in which the fathers of the suitors are trying to get revenge for their dead sons. So is he finally home only when he's fighting again and killing people again? That's a possible reading. There are multiple different possible moments when the homecoming could be said to be complete. Does he come home in different ways with each of the people who recognize him as a different identity? There are also, I think, disturbing questions about whether homecoming is essentially exclusive. Odysseus' homecoming comes at the cost of many, many other people not getting home, as we see in the first few lines of the poem. The second Greek term I've already referred to is zhenya, which means the ideal relationship between strangers, hosts, and guests. In this code, people have a deep obligation to take care of strangers. And through that caretaking and that giving of gifts and the welcoming of a stranger inside your home, families can form lasting relationships over many generations. It's in many ways an inspiring ideal in our time of xenophobia and hostility to immigrants. But the poem is also showing how exclusive that code is. It only applies to elite men. When women try to travel, as in the case of Helen, it doesn't go so well. And also the poem is showing us how easily zhenya can go wrong. So the suitors act like bad guests, invading Odysseus' home without asking. And Odysseus responds by not a very nice host, killing the guests. The original poem, to me, is compelling because of the nuance with which, and the complicatedness of its presentation, of its own core values and ideals. So before I get just to this is the beginning of my translation, I just want to give you one example of complicatedness. I use the word slave for words that I've been shocked to realize how common this is, commonly rendered with servants or maids or housekeepers in other English translations, even those that came out after mine. I think that decision to make the characters who are explicitly slaves in the original into housekeepers in translation is motivated by this desire to idealize the society of Homer and simplify its ethical and social world. So I wanted to bring out the ethical and literary complexity more clearly than I felt other translators had necessarily done. I'm going to read my beginning. Tell me about a complicated man. Muse, tell me how he wandered and was lost when he had wrecked the holy town of Troy, and where he went and who he met, the pain he suffered on the sea and how he worked to save his life and bring his men back home. He failed, and for their own mistakes they died. They ate the sun god's cattle, and the god kept them from home. Now, goddess, child of Zeus, tell the old story for our modern times. So I think you can see that that's a passage about leadership, responsibility, and it's about these multiple different sides that there are to Odysseus. On the one hand, he's the victim of shipwrecks and he's the one who suffers. On the other hand, he's the person who sacked a holy city. So there's the real question about whose fault is it that out of all these men who leave, 12 shiploads full of men, only one gets home. We have the repetition of the word home, kept them from home. These homecomings which don't happen. They don't get home. So the word I translate as complicated in the original is polytropon, which literally suggests much turning or much turned. I wanted to choose a word which was a real word in English, so rather than much turny, which is not a real English word, whereas polytropos is a real word. I also wanted a word that would suggest something of the layeredness of both the character Odysseus and also of the journey and of the poem itself. Polytropos, as we know from later Greek, can be applied to situations as well as to people. So I think it's a programmatic choice of this epithet in the first line. It's a way of defining what is this poem like, as well as what is Odysseus like. And I wanted to signal to the reader, I think this poem is about complexity. So now I'm going to turn to a fairly harrowing passage much later on in the poem. And I apologize for spoilers for people who haven't read the Odyssey. Odysseus does in fact get home to Ithaca. He leaves Calypso, goes through a whole bunch of shipwrecks and adventures. All the men are drowned or eaten. Gets back, disguised as an old beggar with the help of Athena, whose plot the whole poem is. And he finally manages, with the help of the goddess and his son and a couple of useful slaves, to kill all the suitors. Then Odysseus instructs Telemachus, his son, and the others to take the slave women who slept with the suitors, whom Odysseus said earlier in the same book were raped by the suitors, outside and hack all the life out of them with long swords. Telemachus, who up to this point has been a pretty dopey kid, whose only real initiative is shown when he shuts up his mother, which he does twice. Then at this moment, for the first time, he has an idea of his own. He contradicts his big shot father and insists that they must instead be murdered by hanging, because they're too metaphorically dirty for him to touch with his sword. So clearly there's a lot of creepy psychosexual stuff going on in this disturbing passage. There's also to do with the way that Telemachus is defined in terms of, can he grow up to being a man? Will he ever be ready to get married? Those questions are there in the poem and there in this passage. And his issues about women, women's voices, and of course hanging is the easiest way to make sure you don't hear a woman's voice ever again. So this is the Greek, which I'm guessing that many people don't read, but I just wanted to flag the fact that there is no term of abuse in what Telemachus says about the the women. He describes them as the women who slept beside the suitors. So I wanted to just go through several different translation choices and flag how the culmination of different translation choices can make a huge difference to what kind of perspective do we have on this disturbing scene. And it's specifically to what I think is a central question about this passage, but then in general about the Odyssey, through whose eyes do we see? Do we only see through the eyes of Odysseus and Telemachus? Or do we get to see the eyes of the victims of those characters as well? Do we see more than one perspective? So Telemachus is described, as he usually is, as pepnumenos, which suggests that he's taken some kind of thought. Has he taken a good kind of thought? It's open to interpretation whether you decide to translate that very conventional word as something which suggests this murderer at this moment is thinking really smart kinds of things. If you use words like thoughtful, you suggest, great job, he's very thoughtful, this must be a reasonable thing to do. If you say sagacious, again, I think it suggests this is a reasonable action. If you say stern, which I think is a very weird translation of the word, you suggest that he's an instrument of justice. I didn't want to suggest those things because I don't think it's a necessary interpretation, and of course that also then limits the extent to which we're going to be able to think we're allowed to sympathize with the victims of murder. Then a central question is whether the victims are described in ways that either humanize or dehumanize them. Quite a lot of translators add in extra words to suggest that they're dehumanized and also to suggest that they've done evil sexual things which makes them deserve to die. So Lattimore adds in these creatures, which there's no equivalent for in the Greek. Fitzgerald adds in death of a beast. To trolls, use sluts. Again, there's nothing equivalent to sluts in the Greek, or trolls. Fagles, I think, looking back to Fitzgerald, honors these women with sluts and whores. Lombardo, looking back to these other translators, uses sluts. And the very recent Peter Green translation has this long note, which is based on a lot of the scholarly commentary on this passage, which is all about how exactly would you kill 12 women with one rope? It might be quite difficult. You'd have to have a very thick rope, which I think also sets up how are we supposed to read the passage? What matters here? What really matters is how exactly would you manage to do that? I don't think that's what matters. So I didn't put in extra abusive language, which isn't there in the Greek, which is partly because I don't read it in the same way that these translators obviously do. I don't think that what Telemachus is saying is these women deserve punishment. I think what he's saying is these women are a source of shame to me, and therefore I want them dead, which is a different thing from they've done something wrong. And then it matters whether or not you call them slaves, in terms of how much agency does he think they have. So another central issue in terms of what's the perspective is about the simile. There's a great simile in which the women are compared to birds that are flying to their nests. You could read it, as I think most of these translators do, that the simile dehumanizes. It suggests they're not really human beings, they're birds. You could alternatively read it, as I read it, the simile says what they want is a nostos. They want a homecoming. They didn't get to come home. That's where they were going. They were going home to bed, just as Odysseus is. I also think that if you do too much telling and not enough showing, you can detract from empathy. So if you use words like most pitiful, you suggest the pity is happening somewhere else. I don't have to feel it. And then the final point I wanted to look at is what happens in that terrible last detail that their feet are moving but not for a long time. In the Fitzgerald and Fagles translations, there's a creative interpretation of that movement in terms of dancing, such that they're party girls, and of course this is what happens to party girls. They dance for a little while, and then they get dead. And in Lombardo, there's a suggestion they continue to be birds. So again, it makes us okay about not worrying about these. It's like wringing the neck of a chicken. So I think there are multiple different perspectives on the various murders in Book 22, which are not being fully brought out by translations which try to invite us to look only through the eyes of the murderers and not through the eyes of the victims, and also not to distinguish carefully between the various different murderers as well. I think Odysseus and Telemachus don't have the same perspective, and the narrator doesn't have the same perspective as Athena does. So I'm just going to read my translation of that harrowing passage. Telemachus then took initiative, insisting, "I refuse to grant these girls a clean death, since they poured down shame on me and mother when they lay beside the suitors." At that he wound a piece of sailor's rope round the rotunda and round the mighty pillar, stretched up so high no foot could touch the ground, as doves or thrushes spread their wings to fly home to their nests. But someone set a trap. They crashed into a net, a bitter bedtime. Just so the girls, their heads all in a row, were strung up with the noose around their necks to make their death an agony. They gasped, feet twitching for a while, but not for long. So I hope that's a harrowing passage. I want to just talk a tiny bit just to sum up what I think the multiple different things translators have to do, and then I'm going to read a happier passage at the end to cheer everybody up a little bit. So I think translators have to think about multiple different kinds of responsibility, that it's not good enough just to think, if I can read the original, then I've done my work. That, of course, isn't enough. You need to think about the original and read it as well and as responsibly as you can, and think about the original historical context. But you also need to be as good a writer as you can within your own language. You need to think about the poetic traditions within English as well as the poetic traditions within ancient Greek. And you need to think about your own cultural context as well as those of the original, and then what is the relationship between those things, which I think actually becomes clearer if we look at passages like the hanging scene, in which translators who haven't thought about those things enough, haven't thought about their own subject positions enough, are imposing modern versions of misogyny onto this ancient text without interrogating their own, without thinking, how are the misogynies within this text different from my misogynies? How might there be a gap between those things? I think creating a translation in general is like creating a portrait of a person in painting or photography. We can argue about whether this or that image is a good likeness, and there's never going to be full agreement. I don't think that, in juxtaposing my version with others, I don't mean to say I got everything right and they were all wrong. Instead, I mean to say there are multiple different ways to see this. I know that I also, if I were to retranslate the Odyssey in 30 years' time, I would do a completely different thing. And I've messed around with it already for the paperback, and I could keep on messing around with it forever. I think that's actually a good thing. We always need better critical readings, better translations of old, and including very old texts, to keep on remapping the ever-changing, imaginative cultural landscape that divides us from the original. So happier passage to end with. I thought I should, so I wanted to end just by reading my version of the final reunion of Odysseus and Penelope. So one thing I just want to flag is that I've been talking a lot about how I wanted to bring out different perspectives within the poem. I think I feel that way even maybe especially about Odysseus and Penelope, who I think are very clearly characterized as having totally different perspectives on both life in general and their marriage. Which I think is a kind of distinction which gets, to some extent, simplified or toned down, not just in translation, quite a lot of translations, but also in quite a lot of the scholarship, because the tendency to think it's a lovely, happy ending, and we want to sentimentalize the idea that Penelope is smart, so we can celebrate, at least some part of ancient Greek literature is celebrating a smart woman, so that must be good. And marriage is good, and let's hope that we can show how happy and lovely it all is. Which I don't mean to say it's not happy and lovely, but just that I think the original text very clearly shows us how she conceives of her marriage in terms of abandonment, grief, and pain. And she's constantly saying, I've been changed by these last 20 years. He's constantly saying, I have not been changed by these last 20 years. I can change into somebody else anytime I want. But the me that looks all ragged and dirty and as if I have actually grown 20 years older, that's just a divine illusion. Once I get rid of that, I'm back to being exactly the same person I always was. I'm just as dominant of my household as I always was and always will be. And so time can stop. And those totally different perspectives on time also correlate to totally different perspectives on power and agency. He thinks he can control everything by his smartness. She knows that her smartness can only ever delay the time, as with the weaving trick. She can delay the time when she's forced to do something she doesn't want to do, but she can't actually get out of it. She's trapped, and she knows that. She's smart enough to know that. So she finally tricks him, having refused to recognize who he is, even after he's gone to all the trouble of slaughtering all the suitors for her. And even after there's the even after the slave woman gives him a lovely bath and Athena gives him a lovely makeover so he looks gorgeous, she still holds out against him and tests him by claiming to have moved the bed, which is the supposedly immovable bed made out of an olive tree growing inside the house. And he gets furious at this because, of course, what she's saying is the immovable marriage, the rooted marriage that you've spent 20 years away from but have now come back to, isn't necessarily immovable. A man could cut it down. A wife could actually cheat on her husband. It's not impossible. And it's, of course, infuriating for him to be reminded that his power doesn't go everywhere. And he replies by insisting on how skillful, brave, and powerful he was to have constructed this bed, which he describes multiple times in the first person as my bed, which, of course, also says something about his vision of marriage. And she replies by talking about very different kinds of pain, her own pain of loneliness and vulnerability, and her awareness of how many men, perhaps including her husband, are liars and cheats. But I think that the scene also shows us how, despite this huge gap, I think it's only moving if you recognize the gap as well as the closeness. Despite this huge gap, they share a physical object, a bed, a physical space, with physical roots in the ground. And they also have shared memories, shared stories, and a pain which can become shared. So I'm just going to, and then after they recognize each other, there's this beautiful moment of human connection, which ends up with a simile in which the perspective shifts around. So this is also related to what I was saying about the Odyssey includes multiple different perspectives. We think we're looking through the eyes of Odysseus. It's about shipwreck. That must be Odysseus. But no, it's actually about Penelope. So it's a reminder of how, through stories, we can experience deep imaginative, intellectual, and emotional connections with people whose life experiences might seem entirely diverse from our own. She recognized the tokens he had shown her. She burst out crying and ran straight towards him and threw her arms around him, kissed his face, and said, "Now you have told the story of our bed. You made my stubborn heart believe in you." This made him want to cry. He held his love, his faithful wife, and wept. As welcome as the land to swimmers, when Poseidon wrecks their ship at sea and breaks it with great waves and driving winds. A few escape the sea and reach the shore, their skin all caked with brine. Grateful to be alive, they crawl to land. So glad she was to see her own dear husband, and her white arms would not let go his neck. I'm going to stop there. Oh, I'd love questions, yes. Is that what you do? You have questions, right? Yes. When did you first read it? What did you think then? I don't actually remember when I first read a translation. I was Athena in the school play when I was 8 years old. So that was a formative experience for me, and I loved it because I was kind of a shy kid, and I loved getting to dress up as a goddess. That was wonderful, and I made my own tinfoil helmet. And that got me excited about Greek myths. But of course, when I was 8, I wasn't learning Greek. I started learning Greek in high school, and I read little bits of Homer in Greek in high school. So that's why I say 30 years. So it's about 30 years since I first started reading Homer in Greek. And then I read it all in Greek in the first year of college. What did you think of it? I had mixed feelings. I mean, I think for a long time I thought I liked the Iliad better because it's more serious and it's more... life and death questions, I thought about those a lot in sort of dark adolescent thoughts. The Iliad and its focus on death appealed to me more. I think I wrestled quite a lot with the depiction of gender roles in the Odyssey from fairly early on. And I like that it has such a range, and I still like that it has so many different places, so many different kinds of characters. I didn't like certain things about the way it was taught when I was in college. And I felt that there were ways that my response to the poem was being delegitimized by the ways that the professors were telling me what it meant. And I thought, I don't think it means that at all. Yes, well, I'm a white woman, but yes, yeah, exactly. It's sort of always hard to reconstruct, though. It's like, can you remember what your kids looked like when they were younger, when they're older, right? I don't remember exactly how did the Odyssey look to me when I was younger, because I've been looking at it every day since. But yeah.
Hi, I'm interested in your process of translating this project. How much did you use oral performance? Just how you were just speaking both of these passages stood out to me as something that you had probably thought through or even read a lot of this out loud. So I'm just interested if you could talk about that.
Yes, so I definitely did a lot of reading the original out loud and sort of trying to think about when there's alliteration, how do I want to echo that, even if I can't do it in the exact same places. And I did a lot of reading my drafts out loud. And I would read drafts out loud and then reread them if it didn't sound right out loud, because sometimes you can't tell on the page whether it's going to read okay out loud. And then I would realize I have to fix quite a lot of those things because the flow isn't right once I read it out loud. And then I would summon, I was lucky to be at Penn because there were lots of graduate students who I could round up and some of my colleagues and get them to come and listen to me read a book out loud. And I'd have little reading groups once I'd finished a draft I was pretty happy with, and read it out loud, and then we would discuss different things. I definitely thought about, and when I read out loud for occasions like this, I'm definitely aware of, I want the voices to sound distinct. This also relates to the whole issue of how is it have multiple different perspectives, and also to how is Homer the ground from which later Athenian drama emerges. I think maybe it also matters that my first translations were from Seneca's tragedies and Euripides' tragedies, that I translated drama before this, and I definitely had a sense that I wanted to make sure that the voices will emerge as, they have a kind of integrity and could be performed orally by different actors. It doesn't have to be just me putting on my queen voice of Penelope. Yes. But yes, I also definitely, whenever I have to read a passage, I think, how am I going to read Penelope? I'd want her to sound in this particular way, and just trying to think through, even though I don't have the acting skills to do everything I want to do, I want that to be there in the text, such that a better actor could do it more than I can. Yes. Yes.
Thank you so much for this wonderful talk. I was wondering how you reread Helen when Telemachus meets her, when he comes visiting. And of course, I'm also interested in what you have to say about Arete and her very clever remarks about the stories that Odysseus is telling. Mm-hmm. That's always, when I'm teaching the Odyssey, this is always for me very, very interesting to explore with my students and to see how awake they are and how much they are actually wrapped into a narrative that is not thought through and that basically has been taught to them in some way or the other before they start reading the text.
Interesting, yes. So I guess those are two somewhat different questions, but they're related questions, and they're both about depictions of very powerful female rulers in the Odyssey. And in the case of Arete, there seems to be this really interesting inconsistency in the text about who is the most powerful of the two rulers in the land of the Phaeacians. What Nausicaa says at first is, you have to go first to my mother. She's the really powerful one. When she walks through the city, everybody's so amazed by her. She's the one. She's the one to whom we pray, as her name suggests. But then, as the narrative goes on, it seems as if Odysseus is paying most attention to the male ruler, Alcinous. And of course, there's different theories about, are there multiple different possible stages of composition? Are there competing narratives that are being imperfectly fused together in the Phaeacian books, which I think there probably are. I definitely think that there's sort of both parallels and not parallels between the various different depictions of the other female rulers, because of course there are female rulers who just have a rule of all of their own, like Circe or Calypso. They don't have human subjects, but they have other kinds of subjects. It seems as if this poem is engaged with questions about what exactly would it be like to be in a world where women or female powers were extremely, the women were extremely powerful. And in Sparta, where Helen is happily married back with Menelaus, it's as if nothing ever happened, except maybe there are some bad things that happened. I loved doing the depiction of Helen and just sort of trying to make her as charming and seductive and smart as possible, and just which is all there in the original. But I guess one detail that I can talk about is that in both the Iliad and the Odyssey, but I'll talk about the Odyssey one, Helen says that the Achaeans went to war for the sake of her kunopidos emoio. So she calls herself kunops, a word which suggests dog face. And if you look at other translations, they usually say, bitch that I am, or shameless whore that I am. And it doesn't really mean that. And I think it's quite striking that it doesn't mean that. So I think the real questions in the text about, is Helen applying some kind of negative term to herself? In later uses of that word, it isn't necessarily negative. It's used of the Furies in Euripides, which to me suggests that Euripides at least thinks of that word in terms of, it's about a scary, hounding kind of look, which might be to do with Helen's face, not necessarily to do with Helen. Because, of course, also there's this whole question of, is the face the same as the person? Is the disguise the same as the person? If you're a beautiful woman, is that really you? So I sort of changed it around. I made that word into, they made my face the cause that hounded them. So I used hounded instead of dog. But I definitely wanted to bring out, with some kind of clarity, that the Ithacan structure, in which there's this focus on the male line, and where Penelope is repeatedly told to shut up and sent back to her room, that's not the case in other societies within the world of this poem. It's an unusual case. And Odysseus' insistence on making sure that his patriarchal structure stays in place or gets renewed in place, it doesn't sort of stand to reason that because it's archaic Greece, that must be the case. The poem is, of course, showing us that that didn't have to be the case. Yeah.
I was impressed with the variation of translations between the others and yours. And for example, where they described it as slut or whores in a rather vivid, pungent way, you seem to be more polite and say lay beside your suitor. Mm-hmm. Do you have some explanation for the variation, and was there a tendency of you to be more gentle in translating?
It's not about gentleness, it's about accuracy. There isn't a misogynistic term of abuse in the original, so I didn't feel that I needed to put one in when there wasn't anything equivalent to that in the original. I think the fact that these translators have obviously been reading each other, I think is important to why do they all use words like slut? Because I think it's about a particular interpretive tradition, which isn't a tradition that's justified by the text, by the original. It's a tradition that becomes self-justifying within its own world. But I also think, as I said, I think it goes along with a particular interpretation of that scene, which is, of course, also the interpretation that you get in some of the scholarship, as well as in the terrible cliff notes on the Odyssey, that you have this idea that, that what Telemachus is saying is that these women are disobedient and they had agency. Let's pretend they're not slaves. They had some kind of agency. Let's also ignore the line where Odysseus says they were raped. And let's say that they did something wrong. There's something wrong with them. Women with something wrong with them sexually should be killed. And I think that way of translating bolsters that interpretation. I don't think that interpretation is justified by the text. I don't think the text is saying something sort of spicy and naughty, and I'm too much of a lady to use a word like slut. That's certainly not the case. If I felt like that was definitely what the text is doing, then I would wrestle with it. But the text is not doing that. So why would we do it when the original isn't doing it?
It seems, I wonder how long it took for you reading these other translations and, seeing things that you would consider wrong. How long did it take for you to decide to do this translation?
Oh, I did. I didn't actually. I wasn't aware of this particular example when I took on the project, and then I put all translations away for 5 years. So I wasn't aware of this kind of issue. I was just aware. The part I read was book 9 about the Cyclops, because I was curious about whether I felt, just in my experiment, I read maybe 10 versions of book 9 alongside the Greek, and I was curious to see the degree to which translators acknowledged or grapple with the unreliability of Odysseus as a narrator in that sequence, and the degree to which they might undermine or not not recognize what I think is clear in the Greek, which is that Polyphemus is an anthropos, he's a human being. So there's this real complexity about this is a human being, but he's a really weird kind of human being, because he's a non-Greek human being, and his food ways are definitely different from our food ways. And of course that turns out to be, in problematic ways, but it's not that the whole narrative of that book is sort of saying right from the start, Odysseus is good, Polyphemus is bad. And I felt that just in looking at other translations, there was definitely this tendency to present it in that very simplistic way that, of course, the Western invader must be the good guy, and the colonial native inhabitant must be the bad guy, and must have deserved it. So it didn't take me very long to realize that that was a problem for me. But it also didn't take me very long to see that the dominance of free verse translations was also what made me think, even regardless of everything else, just doing something that's regularly metrical felt like it was going to be worth it, even if there wasn't anything particularly new about my interpretations.
Well, it certainly was worth it.
Thank you.
To the rest of us.
Thank you for a terrific talk. Can you comment on the role that Tiresias plays in helping Odysseus to get home, and the fact that he had, at least according to the mythology, spent part of his time as a man and part of his time as a woman, and how that might influence the outcome of the story?
Well, of course, the part of his time as a man, part of his time as a woman isn't referenced in the Odyssey, and to what extent is the Odyssey aware of that tradition if it doesn't reference it? I think there's no way to answer that question, right? I mean, what we get from Tiresias is that he's the Theban prophet, and he's the one who comes up with the prophecy about it's only when you travel to a place where they think that what you carry on your back is a winnowing fan, and then you plant it in the ground, and there's the and sacrifice to Poseidon, then finally your adventures in the sea will be over. And so there's that's the end of the journeys of the battle against Poseidon, or the oppression of Poseidon. I think Tiresias is a relatively minor character. I think there are more important prophets in the Odyssey in terms of this particular the poem we have. I mean, I think it's, of course, the fact that the homecoming isn't a final homecoming is extremely important. The fact that in the part I just read of Odysseus and Penelope's reunion, the way the conversation goes on is that Odysseus, after being really cross-questioned by Penelope about, are you going to stay home now, or are you going to go wandering off again? That's what she asks, and it's a good question, and he says, yes, I'm going to go off again because Tiresias says this about the winnowing fan. I think that matters, but I'm not sure that I feel like when we haven't been told Tiresias matters because he's non-binary. I mean, maybe he does matter in that way, but it's not like we've been told that. We have shown that Athena is non-binary in certain ways, but we're not actually shown that aspect of Tiresias.
Thank you. I have a question about the provenance of the original source material. Is there a single Greek source that all translators are drawing from, or are you consulting multiple sources when you're doing this translation? And roughly, what year are they from? What's the provenance, basically?
Right, so the Homeric Question, or Homeric Questions, of which this is a sort of subset of the various capital H, capital Q Homeric Questions, are to do with, so we know that this poem is based on a very long oral tradition. It's an oral tradition, and yet what are we reading? We're reading a written text. So clearly this is a written text which emerged out of an oral tradition. It's usually thought, and I think this is probably right, that the Greek-speaking world became literate in the 8th century BCE. I think the poem was composed sometime relatively soon after that, probably in the 7th century BC. But then there's a further set of questions, because of course, like all ancient Greek and Latin texts, we don't have the original text from when it first was written down. That's the same for Sophocles as it is for Homer. Instead, we have copies of copies of copies of copies of copies. There's extra complexity with a text which is either a dramatic text, or like a play, or a text which, like the Homeric poems, was experienced throughout classical antiquity primarily through oral performances by rhapsodes who were learning it by heart and then doing oral performances. So it's clear that in the course of those centuries, there were at least minor variations in terms of what was the text like in the 7th century versus what was it then like in the 3rd century, when the first Homeric scholars of antiquity started developing the fixed text, which is what the modern editions are based on. It's based on the text generated by the Homeric scholars of Alexandria, the librarians. And we have a lot of details about their work because we also have commentaries based on those texts, which are much later, but they're based on, we have quotes of earlier comments from those early ancient Homeric scholars. So the modern editions are based on the work of those scholars in Alexandria. There are different theories among modern scholars about the degree to which, over those centuries from the time of Pisistratus, when the Homeric poems were supposedly established as it's going to be the Homeric poems, no other poems that are going to be performed in civic festivals, which implies some kind of fixity about what exactly are the Homeric poems. From that time until the time of the Alexandrian scholars, was there radical inconsistency? Was there radical changes, or was it just minor changes? Was it the case that there was a version of the Odyssey way back then that didn't have Book 24, and then at some point or other, Book 24 got plunked in there? The thing is that we have very good evidence of some very minor changes. We have good evidence, for instance, of in the line of the Iliad where it says that the men were a feast, they were either a feast for birds or they were eaten by all the birds. There were clearly some texts which said one thing, some texts which said another thing. All the birds maybe is not logically a good reading because in fact some birds don't eat human flesh, some birds do. But one could argue about which is the better reading. There are some modern scholars who say maybe there was radical change over the course of those centuries. I personally don't think there's good evidence for that, but there are some scholars who say it all the same. And I think there are some people who kind of like the idea of the free-floating tradition, which was going on being free-floating for longer than you might think. Thank you.
This has been a very rich experience for all of us. We did make one big mistake, and that is that we didn't order books for you to sign. And I think that some of us in the room would like the book, and so if you are going, we will order some books. So if you can tell Allison on your way out that you would like to have a book, we can. We may not be able to have a signed book unless you want to come back rather soon, which we would like.
I'm too busy to do
But
it.
I know. But thank you again for coming, and remember tomorrow night, tomorrow at 5:30, Father Pilares will be speaking to us on the humanities. Thank you.